The quiet hum of St. Mercy Hospital's emergency ward blended with the occasional shuffle of nurses and the faint beeping of heart monitors. Sergeant David Cole, a decorated Marine Corps veteran, sat patiently on the hospital bed, adjusting the thin hospital gown draped over his broad shoulders. The dull ache in his chest had eased slightly, but the doctors insisted on running tests. After everything his body had been through, multiple deployments, injuries, surgeries, he figured a few hours of discomfort were nothing. He glanced at the clock, 1:37 a.m. The emergency room was winding down. A nurse had just left the room, promising to return soon with his blood work results. David was alone. Then, without warning, the door swung open. A police officer stepped inside, his boots thudding heavily against the linoleum floor. He was white, stocky, his uniform crisp, a glint of a badge on his chest, and a sidearm strapped to his belt. His hand already rested on his gun, not casually, but like he was anticipating something. David sat up slightly. "Can I help you?" His voice was calm but firm. The officer's blue eyes narrowed as he looked him over. "Hospital visiting hours are over," he said flatly. David's brows furrowed. "I'm not visiting. I'm a patient." The officer's lip curled slightly, as if he didn't quite believe him. His eyes flicked toward the hospital gown, the IV drip still attached to David's arm. And yet his posture remained tense. "I need you to leave," the cop said, his fingers subtly adjusting on the grip of his holstered gun. David exhaled slowly. He had seen this before, this quiet hostility, this unspoken accusation that needed no words. "I just told you," David said evenly. "I'm a patient here. I was admitted hours ago. You can check with the nurses." But the officer didn't move, didn't even look toward the machines or the charts. Instead, he stepped forward. "There are other rooms if you need to rest," he muttered, his voice edged with something sharp. "But this one's not available." David stared at him, his mind clicking the pieces into place. This wasn't about a hospital policy. It was about him. The way the cop's eyes lingered too long on his face, his broad chest, his dark skin. The way his stance remained rigid, as if he were bracing for an attack that did not exist. David had served his country, fought for it. Yet here he was, being treated like he had no right to sit in a hospital bed. He kept his hands still at his sides, knowing better than to make any sudden movements. "Officer," David said, his voice controlled but firm, "I think you should check with the hospital staff before making assumptions." The cop's jaw clenched. "I don't need to check anything," he snapped. "I told you to get up." David didn't move. The officer exhaled sharply through his nose. Then, without hesitation, he unsnapped the safety strap on his holster. David's stomach turned cold. "You don't want to do that," David warned, his voice low and steady. But the cop wasn't listening. In one swift motion, he drew his gun, pointed it, at a Marine who had faced enemy fire on foreign soil, only to come home and face a barrel in his own country. For a moment, the world shrank. David locked eyes with him, unmoving. The hospital lights buzzed overhead. Outside the door, life went on. Nurses moved, machines beeped. A janitor wheeled a mop bucket past the room, completely unaware of the loaded gun now aimed at a man who had given everything for his country. And in that moment, David knew. This wasn't just a mistake. This was exactly what the officer wanted. The cold steel barrel of the gun remained locked on David's chest, the officer's finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. David didn't flinch. He had seen this kind of fear before, not in war zones, but in men like this. Men who thought power meant control. Men who weren't used to someone standing their ground. "Last chance," the cop said, his voice tight, like he was daring David to move. "I said get up." David exhaled slowly, measured, unshaken. "I fought for this country," he said, his tone steady. "You're pointing a gun at a decorated Marine, a hospital patient, a man who's done nothing wrong." The officer's grip tightened on the gun. "You don't belong here." The words came out quieter, but somehow heavier, and there it was. The real reason. Not a misunderstanding, not a policy issue, just raw, open prejudice. David's jaw flexed, but he didn't let his anger rise. He had learned long ago. Anger made men like this feel justified. Instead, he slowly lifted his hand and tapped the medical alert bracelet still secured around his wrist. The officer's eyes flicked to it. "Go ahead," David said coolly. "Pull the trigger. Then explain to your boss why you just shot an unarmed patient with a heart condition." For the first time, hesitation flickered across the cop's face. David saw it. The moment of doubt, the reality crashing down on him. But the hesitation was brief, because a second later, the officer's jaw clenched again, and his hand remained steady on the gun. No apology, no backing down. Men like him never admitted when they were wrong. Then, footsteps. The sound of rushed movement outside the door. David heard it before the cop did, a sharp shuffle of someone hurrying toward them. And then, what the hell is going on here? The voice was sharp, authoritative. A doctor! The moment the cop turned his head, David knew this was his chance. Not to attack, not to fight, but to make sure the world saw exactly what was happening. The next few seconds would change everything. The moment the officer turned his head toward the voice, David acted, not with violence, but with precision. He shifted just slightly, enough to make himself more visible to the doctor standing in the doorway. His face remained calm, his hands carefully visible, his posture steady, but the message was clear. Look at this. Look at what he's doing. Dr. Elliot Harrington, a senior physician in his 50s, stood frozen in the doorway, his sharp blue eyes darting between David and the gun aimed directly at his chest. His expression morphed from confusion to outright fury in an instant. "What the, officer, what the hell are you doing?" Dr. Harrington barked, stepping inside. His voice boomed through the small hospital room, but his movements were careful, controlled. The officer didn't lower the gun. If anything, his grip tightened. "Stay out of this," the cop snapped, but there was a faint tremor in his voice now. David said nothing. He didn't need to. Dr. Harrington, however, wasn't about to be dismissed. He took another step forward, putting himself in the line of sight between the officer and David. "I said," the doctor repeated, voice like steel, "what the hell are you doing?" "This is a patient under my care, a Marine veteran, a decorated war hero, and you have a gun pointed at him?" The words landed hard. The officer's jaw ticked. He was cornered now, and he knew it. I got a call," the cop said, but even he didn't sound convinced anymore. "I was told to remove a..." "A what?" Dr. Harrington challenged, stepping even closer now. "A patient? A sick man in a hospital gown with an IV in his arm?" His voice rose. "Or just a black man sitting in a place you didn't think he belonged?" Silence. The words hung there. The cop's face reddened slightly, but his grip still didn't ease. David held his gaze, expression unreadable. "Go on," he said quietly. "Finish that sentence." The officer didn't. Dr. Harrington exhaled sharply through his nose and turned toward the hallway. "Nurse," he called out. "Page security, now!" A scurry of footsteps followed. The cop stiffened. His eyes darted toward the door as realization began to set in. He had messed up. Badly. "You're making a mistake," he muttered, but the confidence was gone now. David gave a short, humorless chuckle. "Am I?" The officer's hand twitched on his gun for a second longer. But then, finally, he lowered it. He took a step back, then another. Just as hospital security came running down the hall. But the damage was already done. David could see it in the officer's eyes. He knew this wasn't over. Not even close. The hospital security team, 2 uniformed men in navy blue shirts with badges clipped to their chests, rushed into the room, eyes locking onto the police officer still standing there, gun in hand. "Officer, put the weapon away," one of them commanded, his voice firm but professional. For a second, the room held its breath. The cop's jaw clenched. His eyes flickered to David, then to Dr. Harrington, then back to the security officers. His grip on the gun was still tight. David didn't move. He didn't have to, because at that moment, he knew something the officer didn't. This wasn't a dark alley with no cameras. This wasn't some back road where he could spin the story later. This was a hospital with security cameras, witnesses, nurses, a doctor who was already furious. There was nowhere for him to run. The officer slowly, reluctantly, slid the gun back into his holster. Dr. Harrington didn't let up. "I want his badge number, right now." The cop didn't move. "I said now!" the doctor barked, stepping forward. David remained still, his calm gaze never leaving the officer. For the first time, he saw something else flash across the cop's face. Not anger, not power, fear, because he was losing control, because this wasn't going to be buried. The security guard pulled out a radio. "Dispatch! We need a supervisor up here immediately. We have a situation involving an armed officer." The words hit hard. The cop's face turned red, his hands twitching as though he wanted to reach for his gun again. But he didn't dare. Not now. Not with too many eyes on him. This is ridiculous. the officer muttered, shaking his head. I was just doing my job. Dr. Harrington let out a sharp laugh. Your job? He echoed, voice filled with disbelief. Tell me exactly what part of your job involved pulling a gun on a patient in a hospital bed? The cop said nothing. David leaned forward slightly. His expression was calm, but his words cut like a blade. What's the protocol for that, officer? Silence. The cop's eyes darted toward the door. He wanted to leave. He wanted out. But it was too late for that. Because right at that moment, the hospital administrator walked in, and behind her, 2 more officers in uniform. Not hospital security, internal affairs. And just like that, the tables had turned. The air in the hospital room shifted. For the first time since the officer pulled his gun, the power dynamic was no longer in his favor. The hospital administrator, a sharp-eyed woman in a dark gray blazer, stepped inside first, her gaze sweeping across the room. Behind her, 2 uniformed officers from internal affairs followed, calm, controlled, but unmistakably authoritative. The cop's face tensed. He recognized them, and he knew exactly why they were here. Dr. Harrington didn't waste a second. This officer just aimed his weapon at a hospital patient, he said, voice clipped with anger. I want him off this floor now! The IA officers didn't even look at the doctor. They were already focused on the cop. Officer Howard, one of them said evenly, arms crossed. Let's step outside. The cop, Howard, move. His jaw was clenched so tight it looked like his teeth might crack. Beads of sweat lined his forehead. I was following procedure, he finally said, though his voice wasn't as steady as before. David let out a slow breath through his nose. Here it comes, the excuses, the backpedaling, the attempt to turn his own actions into someone else's fault. I was investigating a disturbance, Howard continued, lifting his chin. I had reason to believe a patient in a hospital bed was a threat. Dr. Harrington cut in, his voice dripping with disbelief. Really? That's the best you've got? The room was silent. Howard shifted uneasily. His eyes flickered to David, as if still trying to justify what had just happened. David tilted his head slightly, studying him. Then he spoke, his voice calm, measured, but sharp as a knife. You wanted me to move, David said. Wanted me to listen. Wanted me to comply. Howard stiffened. But the second someone gave you an order, you froze. David's words hung in the air, the weight of them settling over the room like a heavy stone. And then Howard did exactly what David expected him to do. He snapped. This is ridiculous, Howard barked, his frustration bubbling over. I was doing my damn job. I have a right to. You have a right to remain silent, one of the IA officers interrupted smoothly, and I strongly suggest you use it. Howard's face drained of color. The second officer stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Officer Howard, you're being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. Pending investigation. Howard stared. His fingers twitched. His chest rose and fell in quick, sharp breaths. Turn around, the officer ordered. For a second, just a brief second, David saw it. The moment where Howard considered resisting. The moment he thought about fighting back, about refusing to be treated like the people he had done this to before. But then, reality set in. His hands curled into fists, his face burned red. And slowly, grudgingly, he turned. The metallic snap of the handcuffs closing echoed through the hospital room. David let out a slow breath, and for the first time all night, he finally relaxed. The handcuffs locked around Howard's wrists with a sharp metallic snap. His shoulders stiffened, his breathing shallow, his entire body tensed like a coil ready to spring. But he didn't move. He couldn't. The IA officer's grip was firm on his arm as they started leading him out of the hospital room. David didn't look away. He wanted Howard to remember this moment. The humiliation, the loss of control, the moment when the power he had abused for so long was finally stripped away. Howard tried one last time. This is a mistake. He spat through gritted teeth. I was just doing my damn job. Dr. Harrington, standing just a few feet away, let out a dry laugh, unamused, unforgiving. Oh, really? He said, arms crossed. Pulling a gun on a sick veteran in a hospital bed is part of your job? Howard looked away. He couldn't even defend himself anymore. The IA officer beside him wasn't interested in excuses. You have the right to remain silent, the officer repeated, this time cooler, sharper. I'd suggest using it. Howard's jaw twitched, but he said nothing. David watched him go. Watched as the same system Howard had once used to enforce his own prejudice finally turned against him. Watched as hospital security, nurses, and even other patients in the hallway stopped and stared, whispers already beginning to spread through the building. Watched as, for the first time, Howard was the one being treated like he didn't belong. And it wasn't because of the color of his skin. It was because of his choices. The door swung shut behind them. Silence filled the room. David let out a slow breath, his heartbeat still pounding in his chest. His body was still wired from the adrenaline, but at the same time, relief settled in. Dr. Harrington turned toward him, arms still folded. "Are you all right?" David nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, because he knew something the doctor didn't. This wasn't over. Not yet. Not even close. Because when a cop like Howard loses control, he doesn't go down quietly. And David had a feeling the real battle was only just beginning. The hospital halls remained tense long after Howard had been escorted out. The whispers continued, the weight of what had just happened settling over everyone who had witnessed it. But David wasn't thinking about the stares or the murmurs. He was thinking ahead. Because men like Howard didn't forget. Men like Howard didn't go home, reflect, and change. They retaliated. And David knew, deep down, that this was far from over. Dr. Harrington was still standing nearby, watching David carefully, as if he could sense the thoughts running through his mind. "You should stay overnight," the doctor said, "for observation." David let out a dry chuckle. "I came here for chest pain," he muttered. "Didn't expect the real stress test to be from a cop pointing a gun at me." The doctor didn't laugh. His face remained serious. "I mean it," he said. "That officer, he's dangerous. He's not going to take this lying down." David's expression didn't change, but inside he already knew it was true. He had spent his entire life facing men like Howard, not just on battlefields, but right here at home. "I can handle myself," David said simply. "Doctor," Harrington sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, I'll be honest with you. This is going to get messy. I've seen it before." He paused. "They're not going to stop with just firing him." David finally turned to meet his gaze. "What do you mean?" The doctor exhaled sharply. "I mean the police department is going to try to cover their tracks." David remained silent, because again, he already knew. Howard wasn't just some random officer. He was part of a system that had protected men like him for years. And even though he had been caught red-handed, there would be attempts to bury it, to twist the story, to make David the villain. Dr. Harrington lowered his voice. "We need to move quickly." David raised an eyebrow. "We?" The doctor didn't hesitate. "Yes. We." David studied him for a moment, reading the determination in his face. This wasn't just about a cop pulling a gun in a hospital room. This was about accountability, about making sure Howard never got the chance to do this again. And David, despite the exhaustion, despite the weight of everything, wasn't about to back down. "All right," he said finally, sitting up. "Let's do this." Because if they wanted to bury the truth, David was going to make damn sure they failed. The next morning, the storm had already begun. David woke up to voices outside his hospital room, hushed but urgent. The weight of the night before still clung to him, but his mind was sharp, ready. When Dr. Harrington stepped in, his expression wasn't hopeful. "They're trying to control the narrative," he said without preamble. The department issued a statement. They're saying Howard was responding to a potential disturbance. David let out a slow breath. There it was. The first attempt to rewrite the truth. They were already laying the groundwork, making it sound like Howard had been justified, like David had done something to warrant a gun being pointed at him while he sat in a hospital bed. "They're saying there was a miscommunication," the doctor continued, shaking his head in disgust. Like this was all just some unfortunate mistake. David wasn't surprised. This was how it always went. First denial, then excuses, then victim blaming. But this time, it wouldn't work. Because Howard hadn't just overplayed his hand. He had done it in front of too many people. Too many witnesses, too many cameras, and David wasn't about to let them get away with it. He sat up, ignoring the dull ache in his chest. "What's the hospital saying?" Dr. Harrington's lips pressed into a firm line. "They're backing you." David nodded once. That was the first win. But it wasn't the last battle. Because if there was one thing David had learned from his years in the Marines, it was that winning a fight wasn't just about reacting. It was about strategy. And he had one. He swung his legs over the side of the hospital bed, reaching for the bag of personal belongings the nurses had given him. His phone was still there, fully charged. Dr. Harrington watched him. "What are you doing?" David looked up, his expression unreadable. "Making sure the truth gets out before they can bury it." Because Howard wasn't just going to lose his badge, he was going to lose everything. In the days that followed, hospital security footage was released. The body cam footage from Howard was obtained, the entire truth unraveled before the public eye. David didn't stay silent, and neither did the people who had been in that hospital. Howard wasn't just fired. He was indicted, charged, convicted, sentenced. For the first time, a system that had protected him turned against him. And as David watched the news, seeing the headlines flash across the screen, "Disgraced officer sentenced to life after pulling gun on military veteran in hospital," he knew one thing for certain. This time, justice had won.